Good evening. I'm Michael Lindsay. I serve as the president of Gordon College, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Center for Christian Studies and across campus, let me say welcome to tonight's installment of the Faith Seeking Understanding Lecture Series, as well as the Richard F. Gross Distinguished Lecture Series. As you may be aware, the Richard F. Gross Distinguished Lecture Series is named in honor of Gordon's sixth president, Dick Gross. Dick and his wife, Jody, are here. I want to just invite them to please stand so we can recognize them for their leadership. We are also very grateful for the assistance of our friends at the Center for Public Justice, and I see Stephanie Summers here, who serves as Executive Director. Stephanie, would you mind standing so we can recognize you? Thank you. My colleague, Tal Howard, who serves as the Director for the Center for Christian Studies, is here, who makes all things happen. Tal, we want to recognize you. Please stand. It's a great personal privilege to be able to introduce Michael Gerson, who is our lecturer today. I first got the chance to know Michael Gerson several years ago while I was working on a book called Faith in the Halls of Power. And it was through that experience I got a chance to appreciate not only Mike's intellect and his deep faith, but also his deep commitment to the common good. And we here at Gordon talk about faithful leadership for the common good. And I have to say, Michael Gerson embodies that true to form. Michael Gerson currently is a nationally syndicated columnist. You probably read him twice a week in the Washington Post, Tuesdays and Fridays. That's right. Tuesdays and Fridays. And we wait every week to make sure on Tuesday and Friday. And he was actually just giving a group of the Presidential Fellows a preview of what his column will be tomorrow, so you'll want to check it out. It should be good. Mike is the author of Heroic Conservatism, which was published back in 2007, and his most recent book, City of Man, called subtitled Religion and Politics in a New Era. He holds many roles in many different organizations, but among them, he is a senior advisor at ONE, which you're probably familiar with, is the bipartisan organization dedicated trying to fighting extreme poverty and preventable diseases, popularized by its founder, Bono. He also serves on a number of different organizations. He's co-chair of the Poverty Forum and co-chair of the Catholic Evangelical Dialogue with Ron Sider. From 2006 to 2009, he served as the Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he now holds an appointment at the Center for Public Justice. Mike previously held leadership positions in public life, working in the White House. He was a top aide to President George W. Bush, beginning with his campaign in the late 90s and continuing where he headed the president's speechwriting, and also was a senior policy advisor to the president for 5 years. His final title, he had multiple roles within the White House, but his final title was Assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning, one of the most senior positions in the Bush White House. He was the key administration advocate for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, commonly known as PEPFAR, one of the most significant acts of public policy and of foreign aid issued by our government, as well as the President's Malaria Initiative. He's been actively involved in a variety of initiatives. You'll be pleased to know that we actually have Admiral Tim Zimmer will be coming to speak in a couple of weeks' time as part of the Conversations with the President series, which we hope all of you will join us for. That will be here in this building on Monday, October 8th at 4 o'clock. Mike has also been actively involved in fighting on the global scale sex trafficking, as well as providing support for issues of women's justice and empowerment. Truly has a large portfolio of commitments and also a deep faith. Prior to his time working with President Bush, he was a senior editor at the U.S. News and World Report, as well as was a speechwriter and policy advisor for both Jack Kemp, as well as a speechwriter for Bob Dole during his 1996 presidential bid, and then also served as a policy director and senior advisor to Senator Dan Coates. After graduating from Wheaton College, he worked closely with Chuck Colson and has just an amazing story. It is a deep honor for us to have my friend and our great speaker today. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gerson.
Thank you so much. It is really an honor for me to be at Gordon, the most important evangelical academic institution in the center, the capital of America's academic center. And so it's always reminded me a little bit of like Wheaton without the attitude. But it also is great to be with Michael, who is an old friend. He actually studied me in one of his sociological projects, as he mentioned, which makes me more of a laboratory rat than a friend, but I enjoyed getting to know him anyway. I know I'm coming here in the middle of a very bitter polarized political season. Things are very divided in America. One poll, and this is true, it's a Harris poll, found that 24% of Republicans agree that Barack Obama, quote, may be the Antichrist. This is what passes for an undecided Republican voter these days. They're not quite sure if Barack Obama is the Antichrist or not. But it's my goal not to talk about these divisive issues. I want to talk instead about opportunity, an issue everyone claims to agree on but seldom talks about, a value that defines America but is fleeing from American life. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. Speechwriters are supposed to be anonymous, and at this task I've succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. I didn't take the traditional Washington path. I was a Bible and theology major at Wheaton College. I went to work for Prison Fellowship Ministries for Chuck Colson, who will be remembered as one of the great social reformers of the 20th century. How we treat prisoners, some of the most despised people in our society, is a test of our commitment to human dignity. And the former prisoners I met working in Prison Fellowship will always be my greatest examples of the transforming power of Christ, people more mature in their faith than I could ever hope to be. But my driving interest was political. I spent some time as a policy advisor on Capitol Hill, some time in political journalism. Then I got a call from then Governor George W. Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at a D.C. hotel. The first thing he said was, "This isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address. And I want you to move to Austin immediately." At this point, he was not even a declared candidate for president, but I packed up my family and went. From the beginning, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He's outgoing, social, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one policy session at the governor's mansion in Austin, everyone had gone but me, and the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, "Do you want to hang out a little while?" With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, "Not really," which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and as a person. He is, above all, a man without a mask. Interest, frustration, boredom, sadness come unfiltered to his face. He's kind and loyal to people around him. And he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." My life changed direction on September 11th, 2001, like the lives of many. I was working at home. The president was in Florida when my deputy at the White House, who was watching events in New York, said I should come in immediately. I was headed into work on a clear morning down Interstate 395 when I saw a plane flying low over the highway headed toward the Pentagon, so low that I could see the windows. Days later, I sat in the National Cathedral for the memorial service, and I saw how in a few historical moments, the words, the rhetoric, can really matter to the country. The president said, "This world he created is of moral design. Grief and tragedy and hatred are only for a time. Goodness, remembrance, and love have no end, and the Lord of life holds all who die and all who mourn. The pace of those years, including 9/11 and war and natural disaster, was at times exhausting. It has a cost to your health. In December of 2004, while I was working on the president's second inaugural address, I had a heart attack. The president's doctor had me checked into the hospital under an assumed name to avoid all the press calls. Adding insult to incapacity, there wasn't a single call. And it has a cost to your family. During the heat of the 2004 presidential election, my little boy Nicholas, who was then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him I think I could get a job, I might go to a think tank. And he said, "Of course, what's a think tank?" So I told him, well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" After that election in 2004, my job at the White House changed. I became a policy advisor focused on global health and development and genocide, areas where my interests had been leading me for many years. And I saw something very hopeful. In one of the bitterest times of partisanship in modern history, I also found a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology have come together. As part of my job at the White House, I worked with conservative and liberal groups to fight global AIDS and to confront malaria and to oppose global sex trafficking and to confront the crisis in Darfur. And I've seen some odd alliances grow. I've gotten to know Bono of U2 pretty well. A couple of years ago, he invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After that dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I'm a fellow at the One campaign founded by Bono. I've appeared with Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, which is the only accomplishment I've ever had that impressed my children. And I'm associated with the Center for Public Justice, an organization many of you know, a long history with Gordon, that is dedicated to applying the principles of faith to issues of public policy. My focus today is opportunity, where it comes from, who has a responsibility to provide it. The good news is that we're having a national debate on this essential topic. The bad news is that the debate is very, very shallow. Republicans endlessly repeat President Obama's gaffe that if you started a small business, you didn't build that. The whole GOP convention, which I just attended, consisted of saying, "We did build that," which sounded like an extended commercial for Home Depot. Democrats tend to defend government and accuse Republicans of social Darwinism. One video at the Democratic National Convention called government, quote, "the only thing we all have in common," as though we are one nation united by entitlements, dedicated to the proposition that all men are clients. There is a general feeling in America that opportunity is being lost, that the social contract is somehow being changed. The Tea Party thinks an oppressive government is at fault. Occupy Wall Street thinks an oppressive economic elites are at fault. The anger is understandable, but sometimes the solutions seem a little disconnected to me. I have a hard time imagining the initial planning meetings. So American liberty is threatened, so let's dress up in costumes like the Founding Fathers. Or the 1% are oppressing the workers, so sleep in a pup tent and bang drums. At one point, Occupy Wall Street actually decided to occupy the New York subway. If there is one place to confront the nation's wealthiest 1%, it's not the subway. At the same time this drama was going on, Sociologist Robert Putnam of Harvard University was conducting a study on the nature of opportunity. He sent one of his researchers to his hometown of Port Clinton, Ohio, an old factory town where many of the good, well-paying blue-collar jobs are now gone. The interviewer talked with a real woman, given the fictitious name of Mary Sue. Her parents divorced when she was small. Her mother started stripping and would leave her for days at a time. Her new stepmother would beat her and confine her to a single room. Mary Sue told the researcher that her only friend at the time was a little yellow mouse who lived in the apartment. She went into juvenile detention for selling pot. One boyfriend burned her arm with cigarettes. Her current boyfriend had 2 children from 2 other women. It's a haunting image to me. A little girl abandoned by her parents, left in the company of a yellow mouse. What does opportunity possibly mean in a case like this? Putnam calls this case, quote, distressingly typical among the American working class, and it demands our attention. America has a number of serious challenges. We face an entitlement crisis under the pressure of demographics and increasing costs that threatens to consume every other purpose of government. We face an economic challenge of slow growth and competitive pressure. But we also face a social crisis, growing divisions based on class that threaten the American ideal and make all our other challenges more complex. Putnam describes a number of growing gaps between the working class and more affluent American families. There's the goodnight moon and soccer sideline gaps, in which lower-income parents spend nearly an hour less a day with their children than upper-income parents. There's a religious involvement gap and a community engagement gap, less time spent in sports and clubs and youth groups. There are gaps in academic achievement, college admissions, and social trust. The problem is that all these factors predict success later in life. So each of these gaps opens up an opportunity gap down the road. The worst American mobility and opportunity was set by social conditions 20 or 30 years ago, which have degenerated quickly, which means that mobility is about to plunge dramatically. Says Putnam, a social mobility crash is coming. Why is this happening? There seem to be a number of causes that are not easily categorized according to ideology. One reason is clearly the collapse of working-class families. Another is the disappearance of well-paid, low-skilled jobs from many communities over the last few decades. Another is the decay of working-class neighborhoods, which used to have stronger networks of models. Whatever the mix of causes, the result is a durable, deepening national divide, increasingly rooted in class. This is an attack on the self-image of America. Americans are generally comfortable with inequality in a free economy, as long as economic advancement is a realistic goal. But economic inequality without economic mobility is just a caste system in which birth becomes destiny. Americans will accept unequal economic outcomes in a fair, fluid system. They object when the results seem rigged from the start. This problem is a practical economic challenge. We're talking about perhaps a third of American workers coming from circumstances that do not fully prepare them for productive contribution. A third of workers betrayed by the circumstances of their birth. And this problem is a moral challenge. The Mary Sues of the world do not deserve their circumstances. In a class-based society, the most important choice you ever make is the choice of your parents, which is not a choice at all. This is a good definition of economic injustice. Massive disadvantage without doing anything to deserve it. When Abraham Lincoln described the American ideal, he said, "There is no permanent class of hired laborers among us. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire laborers to labor for him tomorrow. Advancement, improvement in condition, is the order of things in a society of equals. Whatever your view of economic inequality, opportunity should be a shared national goal because it is the proper order of things in a society of equals. And yet, if you listen to our current political debate, you won't hear much on this topic. Republicans tend to talk about economic freedom. Democrats tend to talk about the wealthy paying more in taxes. And both parties tend to talk most about the middle class, not the poor or the working class, because that is what their political advisors tell them is where the votes are. It amounts to a strange inversion of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the middle class, for they shall inherit the largest tax deductions. But part of the silence on class is not only political, but ideological. Listening to the two-party conventions, you'd think that the only two social options that we have are rugged individualism or bureaucratic centralization, the isolated individual or the all-providing state. Republicans often adopt the language of libertarianism, presenting modern politics as the contest between the makers and the takers. It matters little that Republican policy is not actually libertarian, merely an attempt to keep existing federal health and retirement commitments within a sustainable percentage of the economy. But lacking a language to describe this goal, Republicans tend to talk like the heroes of an Ayn Rand novel, which are very difficult to distinguish from villains in any other novel. Democrats also have an ideological blind spot. Yuval Levin, a very smart guy who's editor of National Affairs, describes it this way, quote, "The president simply equates doing things together with doing things through government. He sees the citizen and the state and nothing in between. And thus every political question is a choice between radical individualism and a federal program." But the genius of American society has always been a more complex and interesting mix. First, individual enterprise and responsibility are foundational in a free economy. The system only works when there are rewards for success and consequences for failure. Markets can be harsh. They are also the best, most efficient way to distribute goods and services. And when markets work properly, they honor and encourage effort and human creativity. Other systems have promised universal justice and delivered nearly universal poverty, except among the elites that do the redistributing. Free markets, in contrast, have taken billions out of poverty in the last several decades, an economic achievement unrivaled in human history. Second, working markets do not exist in a social vacuum. They depend on working public systems of justice and education. In the absence of the rule of law, markets can become predatory. Accumulated economic power can undermine genuine free exchange. Education, both public and private, is essential to prepare men and women for opportunity, particularly in global markets that demand advanced skills. And government is necessary to make a decent provision for the helpless. Third, there is a broad realm between the individual and the state where opportunity can be encouraged or undermined. Strong, committed families are essential to the creation of productive citizens, instilling values, self-confidence, and a work ethic. Religious institutions help pass character between generations. Charities and community institutions build habits of social trust and cooperation. Returning to the political question, who builds opportunity? The answer is this: we own what we build, but as human beings, we are also built, not primarily by government, but by institutions that shape our character. Responsible, self-governing citizens do not grow like wild blackberries. They are cultivated in families, religious institutions, and orderly, hopeful neighborhoods. And government has a limited but important role in creating an atmosphere where community can flourish. So what do we do to deal with the social mobility crash and to promote equal opportunity? Let me start by saying that it's not politically hopeless. There are some recent precedents here. It wasn't that long ago that Bill Clinton ran for president talking about a new covenant in which government benefits would bring greater expectations of personal responsibility. Bill Clinton campaigned on welfare reform and the expansion of the earned income tax credit, policies that required work and increased the reward of work. It wasn't long ago that George W. Bush ran for president as a compassionate conservative, hoping to use government to catalyze the work of private and religious institutions in saving and changing lives. He talked about rejecting two narrow mindsets. Quote, "The first is that government provides the only real compassion. There is another destructive mindset, the idea that if government would only get out of the way, all our problems would be solved, an approach with no higher goal, no nobler purpose than leave us alone." There's one nice thing about being a former speechwriter, that you can quote the President of the United States and really be quoting yourself. Eventually, the political class will be required to deal with the opportunity gap. The challenge is to have ideas and policies ready. A number of groups are doing that groundwork, such as CPJ and the Economic Mobility Project and Opportunity Nation, which has a summit next week where I'll be co-hosting a session with Bob Putnam. There is one advantage on these issues. Both liberals and conservatives, I think, have something to offer. It is a genuine opportunity for cooperation. Putnam calls it a perfectly purple problem. He means that both red America and blue America have insights to offer and contributions to make. Values and family are essential to opportunity. So are communities with decent jobs at a decent wage. So are working public schools. So are stable communities where religious institutions play a leading role. I'm not going to end with 10 policy points. That's the role of policy experts. But I will end with 5 social scientific correlations that will need to inform a serious public debate on opportunity. Economic mobility is strongly correlated with the structure of families. Children raised in single-parent families are more likely to experience poverty and drop out of schools, and less likely to get and keep jobs. If America had the same fraction of single-parent families as it had in 1970, by one estimate, the child poverty rate would be about 30% lower than it is today. Economic mobility is strongly correlated with education. A college degree is the major factor in determining who will move up the economic ladder and who will not. Yet only 30 out of every 100 high school students will graduate from college. Children of low-income parents who gain a college degree triple their chances of earning $85,000 a year or more. Economic mobility is connected to the health of communities. It is lower in socially disorganized and economically depressed neighborhoods. The ties of friendship, faith, and association have very real economic influence. Economic mobility is both influenced by physical health and leads to better health. Low birth weight and other physical conditions in early childhood can limit academic achievement and the earnings in adulthood. And economic mobility is often enabled by wealth, savings, and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs who survive 5 years in business move upward, have much higher economic mobility than wage workers, although it's fair to point out that many do not survive 5 years in business. If America wants to address the opportunity gap, it will need to think creatively about these 5 areas: family structure, education, community health, physical health, and wealth building. None of these issues is easy, but they become impossible if we ignore them. Policy approaches will vary, of course, and some will fail. Some of those approaches will require government, others charities, other volunteers. But all of these efforts require recognition. Equality of opportunity is not a natural state. It is a social achievement for which all of us are responsible in one way or another. As I mentioned, my favorite American thinker on opportunity is Lincoln, the greatest advocate not just of human freedom, but of free labor and the internal improvements to make workers more productive. I have often inquired of myself, he said, what great principle or idea it was that kept this confederation so long together. It was not the mere matter of separation of the colonies from the mother land, but of something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise in due time that weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. It would be a terrible thing for any generation to preside over the expiration of that hope for a large portion of the American people. But the promise remains vivid and powerful, that all should have an equal chance. Thank you very much.
Mike, it's our custom for there to be a small token of appreciation that we give to folks who come for the Gross Lecture Series.
Thank you.
And hope that you can put that to some good use.
Fantastic. Do you want me to open it?
Yeah, of course, because they don't know what you're getting.
Of course.
So, suspension.
Oh, that's great. The Thinker.
The Thinker bookends.
Yeah.
To put all of your books between.
Thank you.
So we have time for some conversation, as is our custom here with the Conversation with the President series. What we'll do is we'll invite those folks in the audience to text or email their questions to my iPad, and we'll have a way of bringing your thoughts into the conversation. So I'll look forward to seeing what you send. But Mike, if I get the first set of questions,
sure.
If that's all right. One thing I'd like to hear a little bit more about is the role in which Christian higher education played in your own development, both as a thinker, as a writer, and as someone who was captivated by the opportunity to make a difference in public life.
You know, I was a transfer student. I started off at Georgetown University in Washington in the School of Foreign Service doing international relations, and came to not a crisis of faith, but more of an intellectual crisis, which is I wasn't taking courses that would satisfy my graduation requirements. I was taking all philosophy and theology classes. And I had a real desire to get the most basic questions answered before I moved on to other things. And so I looked at Gordon at that point, and I looked at Wheaton. Those were my finals, and ended up at Wheaton. Precisely because a liberal arts atmosphere is the place, instead of doing professional training, to train the mind. So I took a lot of great classes. I had Arthur Holmes. I don't know if you know, who was a great history of philosophy. A year-long history of philosophy course. I took a lot of theology and philosophy classes, and had some experiences. I spent the summer after my junior year with John Stott in London at the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and so I'm a big fan of the liberal arts education. I think it's important to get the big questions down, and you only do that through interdisciplinary studies. It had a large influence on me. But I was headed to study at Fuller Theological Seminary. I was going to get a THD. Richard Mao was going to be my advisor. And then got a call from out of the blue from Chuck Colson, who had seen some things I'd done in the Wheaton College newspaper and wanted help writing a book. And so moved out to the Washington, D.C. area and took kind of a different course. But that was, for me, it was a decision that it was a very conscious decision and one that I never regretted. So.
I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about how, in the moments after 9/11, you, I imagine, immediately knew that there would be something called of you to help communicate for the president what was the pent-up anxiety and concerns of the American people in, I guess, a series of addresses. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how the intellectual capital that you had built up really over the course of your life came to serve you well in that moment when you didn't have a lot of opportunity to read. You were really drawing upon a well that had been dug a long time ago, and how that informed your own sensibilities as you were helping to put the words together that the president would offer to both comfort the American people and also articulate his position in response to the attacks.
Well, you're correct about kind of the way that deadlines became truncated. When you're, without going into all the details, when you're working on presidential speeches, you usually have anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, with some things on the schedule, and you're preparing. And, I had 6 writers working for me. I had 3 full-time researchers, 3 full-time fact-checkers. And we had anywhere from 1 to 3 public events a day. It was like a factory, a word factory. President speaks far too much, in my view, but all presidents do. And but it's an orderly process. After 9/11, the schedule was thrown away, and we never had more than 48 hours notice for any event. The National Cathedral speech had to be produced between 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock on a single day. The speech to Congress was produced, the September 20th speech was produced in 2 days. And that, I will have to tell you though, it sounds strange, but it is a tremendously exhilarating experience when you realize every single word the president said mattered greatly. Every word he said was carried live on national television. September 20th speech was watched in every bar in America. They broke into hockey games on the Jumbotron and played stopped the game to play the speech. And so I went for, 3 weeks, working all the time and having a tremendous amount of energy. At the same time, we were having constant alarms at the White House, threats, evacuations all the time. Eventually, I just worked through them. I didn't have time to evacuate because we were evacuating twice a day. So it really did, it focused things. I was fortunate that by that time I'd worked a couple of years with President Bush. If I had just been starting, there was no way that that would have worked. So I had a feel for his voice. And then for me, just as far as my own professional interest in speechwriting, it was a historical interest. And so I knew how other people had dealt with these kind of issues. I'd gained a lot of respect for Franklin Roosevelt and the way he dealt with crisis, and the golden age of American speechwriting in the 1960s with Ted Sorensen, who I got to know, and Adam Walensky and others. And so some of it is historical resources. I'd read a lot of the way presidents responded to crisis, and it informs what you do in those circumstances. But I would say at some level, which wouldn't be true in some other circumstances, the president was an evangelical, brought a certain value-based perspective to things that I was very comfortable with. We can talk about it more, but I'd given a lot of thought to the proper role of religion in American rhetoric. I was determined that we were not going to be partisan, that we were not in the use of religion, that we were not to be sectarian, but that it was going to play, it had to play an important role in both comforting a nation and providing some assurance that there is meaning beyond events that are just without moral explanation. when people die going to work on a, clear September morning. The evidence before your eyes is that they mean that that the universe is a random, cruel place. And it's part of the president's role in a circumstance like that to say that there is kind of an arc of meaning and justice beyond the evidence of our senses. And so that's some of the things we tried to do.
A number of questions have come in where folks are asking about your understanding of the role of faith in presidential rhetoric. Mm-hmm. And we'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Mm-hmm. Are you, in general, pleased in the current election campaign with the way in which faith has been used in the candidates' rhetoric, or do you disapprove?
Well, I think it's the American tradition, if you look at American rhetoric, that for the most part, it avoids being sectarian. I mean, it is not a constitutionally legitimate role to use public office to favor one religious tradition above another religious tradition. It's not permissible, okay? And you have to keep that, within proper bounds. But a belief in providence is a traditional American commitment. The use of religious language to comfort those who are grieving is part of that American tradition. Recognizing the important role that religion plays in creating community, that's an important part of our tradition. And so, I always tried to keep some lines in mind. For example, I don't think it's legitimate to say that God is on the side of America, but I think it's perfectly legitimate to say that God is on the side of justice. I mean, you wouldn't have any language from Martin Luther King apart from that affirmation. That's an appropriate religious use in American rhetoric. I also some people object that think it's somehow illiberal to use religious metaphors and references. And, you just can't have American rhetoric without a house divided against itself cannot stand, or, a promised land of freedom. These are not code. They're not violation of the Constitution. They're just our culture. Mm-hmm. And it's the way that rhetoric has been traditionally shaped in American history. I have to tell you, I don't think that... I wish Mitt Romney talked more about his faith. I know that he has some serious reservations because there are objections to Mormonism in America. But if you actually read his biography, it's an essential part of who he is. It explains so much about him, and it's generally quite favorable. But there's not much of it. He'll sometimes mention it, particularly in the context of family. But we've gone from, accusations under George Bush that there was too much religious rhetoric. I don't think we're seeing that much religious rhetoric. So a little bit of it at the conventions. But it's, I don't think, there's a way to talk about religious values in American public life that's divisive, and there's a way that's unifying. And you have to be very careful about those distinctions. Mm-hmm.
The questions are rolling in, so I'll have to try and get as many in as possible. So one that somebody wants to know is, did you ever see the show West Wing? And if so, how much does that show reflect life in the West Wing or not?
As far as setting, I had an office in the West Wing, right next to the Roosevelt Room. And it's quiet like a library. There are very few offices there. There are only 3 public spaces in the West Wing. There's not people running around. It's pretty closely monitored. Who comes close to the president. In the area, these areas of the White House. Most people who work at the White House work at the old executive office building right across West Executive Avenue, which I don't think ever appeared in the West Wing, but that's actually where people work. But I will say, I don't know, it introduced a lot of people to the authentic thing about the White House is how you're having to deal with 5 different things at once, at any given time. International crisis and domestic political issues, and there is that quality about it where it's constant. The pace, the setting may be more quiet, but the pace is frenetic. And I will tell you, I actually got to know Rob Lowe when I was at the White House.
Oh.
I saw him just not too long ago, and actually got him a copy of the September 20th speech signed by the president, which he has up on his wall in his office out in Hollywood. So there were similarities and differences.
Did you always have to wear a coat and tie in the Oval Office?
Always, yeah. Even coming in, I remember when the shuttle, blew up. It happened under Reagan, but it also happened coming back into orbit under Bush. And I came in without a tie, and they made me find a tie. It was on a Saturday.
So that dress code policy is pretty strict.
It was under the Bush era. He had a way of taking himself not very seriously, but actually taking the office quite seriously.
So someone also written that they noticed that it appears that you spoke from handwritten notes, and they're curious what's sort of your method for writing. I remember that when I came to your office, there were lots of gnarled pen tops on the desktop. And I also remember that you have a penchant for writing in Starbucks.
No, I still do that. I write my column usually in coffee shops because it's a lonely occupation. Just sitting in a room. And so having people around is actually important sometimes. And it's a solitary job. But I still write out things. I'm of a different generation. My children compose on the computer, and I have a harder time doing that because I have to outline everything. And it's harder for me to do.
Are you a fast writer?
I've gotten to be a disciplined writer when you have to produce 800 words twice a week, no matter what. But I found that if I've had a good day of talking to people on the phone and doing research and reading a bunch of material, it's easy to write. If you're 24 hours away and you have no idea what you're going to say and you've done no research, it's hard to write. So preparation is really kind of a key.
If you had to estimate how many hours you spend both preparing and writing an 800-word column, how many hours is that?
Well, to prepare a column, it's a good full day. And then, if you're lucky, it takes 6 hours to write. And that leaves me some time to do other things, but then you're meeting with people and doing things. So.
If you had to give advice to a student who's here who would like to have had the journey that you have had, what counsel would you give to them? If there was something that you could have done while you were an undergraduate that would help you along the path that ended up becoming your own journey, what would that be?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience, but my comparative advantage in every stage of my life was just an ability to write, and it's a rare ability. And people who have it get jobs. And so, it's the kind of transferable skill that a lot of people don't have. And those kind of skills are important. And there are a bunch of them. Writing is just one of them. But it's, I found when I went to Capitol Hill that almost everyone was a lawyer and they had been professionally prepared not to be able to write. They'd been taught to communicate in ways that didn't communicate broadly. And so it was an advantage to some extent.
How did your time working so closely with the president shape you as a person? Either how did he shape you personally, or how did the role shape you to who you are today?
It's difficult. White House life was so busy that you neglect other areas of your life, and people find that in high-pressure professions. But as is often the case, I also went through kind of deepening of my faith while I was there, just out of dependence and a sense of your own limits. I will tell you, as far as the president's example, he's the best example I've ever known of someone whose life had changed completely, and the evidence was discipline. At 40 years old, George W. Bush drank much too much and didn't know what to do with his life. His family was worried about him when he was 40 years old about what he would do. And he had a conversion experience. He became a runner. He had the most rigid physical regimen I've ever seen. He was time-oriented. Meetings were never late. He had, kind of conquered his own nature to some extent through discipline, and it's the reason he became president of the United States. He also showed just great stability in very trying circumstances. I'll always appreciate that he was keeping staff morale up, that he was really so solid in the aftermath of 9/11. I had members of my staff who had to leave the White House because of psychological issues, because of the level of both pressure and threat. We had chemical and biological sniffing trucks out on West Executive Avenue, and there were thoughts. It was a very high-pressure work environment. They had full-time counselors that they brought in to deal with people, the pressure that people were under. But he was, he was a tremendous source of kind of even stability in a very difficult circumstance.
I don't know if you're aware, Mike, that one of the people who played a very formative role in Chuck Colson's conversion experience was Tom Phillips, who was the CEO of Raytheon, who is a Gordon trustee, been on our board for many, many years. So I think our folks would be very interested in a couple of questions relate to this of how was Chuck Colson a mentor to you? What role did he play in your own development?
Well, there were two sides of it, because I had read all the Watergate books and was interested in politics, and he does not come across well in the books. He's not a very admirable person. And then when I went to work for him, he will always be my example of the most thoroughly converted human being I've ever known. Every predisposition had been changed, fundamentally and radically changed. And he was enthusiastic to talk about his faith in any setting because of what God had done for him. It was just tremendous inspiration. But then I benefited from the fact, given my interests, that there was part of him that was still thoroughly political. He was not playing a political role anymore, but he knew politics. He knew people in public life. He was up on everything. He very sophisticated in a way that many evangelicals are not about the way the political process works. So it's just an example of how God can change the worst things about a human being and keep a set of driven talents. He had this. When I worked for him, he still had the standards of the White House. He had very high expectations of people who worked for him. He was a demanding, exacting employer. And that comes from being a Marine. That comes from working in the White House. And it was just also a statement that that Christians can have unbelievably high standards. So I think both of those things influenced me.
If you had to identify a couple of thinkers, philosophers, theologians who most shaped your political philosophy, who would those be?
Well, I'm not so much for the thinkers. I was very influenced by Catholic social thought, which is, which you'll see if you read between the lines what I said today, about solidarity and subsidiarity being a kind of a unique Christian contribution to political philosophy in the last several decades. I don't come from a Catholic background, but if you take seriously what is the main Christian reflection on the nature of government, individuals, and civil society over the last several decades, it's the Catholic Church. And I don't think that Christians who want to take those things seriously can avoid the teaching of the Church. It's a construct that avoids both individualism and and liberty as license and or indifference. And so, if you're looking, as far as models of political engagement, who had some influence on me, you look at somebody like John Paul II, who I got to meet a couple of times, which was an extraordinary experience. Really some of the high point experiences of my time in government. Someone who could keep that very Christian contribution, which was a belief in enduring moral values and a deep concern for for those in need, and the most vulnerable, including the unborn. That should be the kind of contribution that Christians make, the distinctives that they offer. He played that role in many ways. I've been influenced by the Kuiperian tradition, which is represented by CPJ, which, by the way, I think is very consistent with those views, the kind of sphere sovereignty and the reformed reflection on these issues. But also, you just have to be influenced by good social science too, about kind of what works. So I was influenced by a little book by Peter Berger and Richard Newhouse called To Empower People, which talked about trying to find innovative ways to use government to encourage the work of private and religious charities in providing social services. And it's my time in government,
what do you think is the noblest and best use of government?
Well, I've spent enough time, I spent a significant amount of time in Africa, and most people don't appreciate how good, non-corrupt, efficient government is essential to just about everything else. If you go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I've been to 3 times in the last year and a half, nothing good can happen without the rule of law. Physical insecurity is the biggest enemy of justice. And we just take that for granted, but a lot of places don't take that for granted. And so people that are involved in those realms, in my view, people in the military, people in the judicial system, police, people that administer government programs, are actually involved in a very noble purpose, doing the kind of basic elements of what government does. And so, it needs to do what it does. It needs to do the things that without which nothing else is possible, and it needs to do those things well. I've also seen an example, though, a couple of examples of where just a vindication of the idea that human dignity matters. And in those circumstances, government can be kind of heroic. I'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow, but I got to sit in the Oval Office and watch the President of the United States make the decision to pursue the emergency plan for AIDS relief. $15 billion, 15 focused countries, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. And at the time that I worked on the language to announce that in the 2003 State of the Union address, and that is not very long ago, there were 50,000 people in all of sub-Saharan Africa on AIDS treatment. And today there are over 5 million. It is one of the largest humanitarian achievements since the Marshall Plan. Americans don't know much about it. But it shows what government can do under the right circumstances. Rigorously designed, outcome-oriented. I hope all of you come to hear Admiral Ziemer. He's a very unassuming man, But I was involved before the Gleneagles G8 in helping put together the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI, which is a plan to reduce child and infant mortality from malaria by 50% or more in a bunch of focus countries. And we brought in an admiral to do the job, which Barack Obama's kept on the job, which is a tribute to him. And here's someone that Americans don't know about who has helped save hundreds of thousands of lives, mainly children under 5. And it's one of the best things about what America does in the world. And it shows under the right circumstances what government can accomplish.
I wonder if we might close and you share a funny story or a particularly poignant moment that you remember from your time in the White House. Lots of the questions related that they're just curious of what it's like to be sort of in that inner circle. And I know that there are heavy and serious things that occur, but we wondered if there might be something lighter or more memorable from your interactions, either with President Bush or with other colleagues that stand out.
Well, I do have to say there is part of it that is just enjoyable. So I don't want to, just emphasize the burdens. I got to go on the state visit as part of the delegation with the president to England, to Great Britain.
Did you dance with the Queen?
No, but I stayed at Buckingham Palace.
That's pretty good consolation prize.
And I had a full-time footman assigned to me named Russell, who I really miss. It is a little strange when they draw your bath, though, and it is odd. There are just wonderful parts of the job, tremendous. You meet amazing people. You get to meet Václav Havel, or you get to meet, just extraordinary kind of circumstances. But I will tell you, the things that I came to appreciate about President Bush were just the loyalty he showed to staff, creating an environment that allowed you to be there for years, because the tenure of most White House jobs is much shorter than that. I told it earlier, but I just remember when I first went to work for him, I made a mistake, and I put something in his speech that got the president in trouble, then Governor Bush in trouble, and made the way to the media. My name got in the media. It was controversial. He was being hurt by it, and it's the worst feeling in the world, to go and work for someone and then you're hurting them. And I remember going home and just sick feeling in the pit of my stomach and going to bed early, and getting a phone message that night from him, 10-minute phone message. Don't worry about this. I've been through this many times. It happens in politics. And then having him wake me up on the phone at 6:45 the next morning, I just want to make sure you're okay. And when people show loyalty, then it builds loyalty. So that's the person I saw all the time. It was hard that sometimes the public image was not, quite congruent with that. And still, keep in contact with him. But those are the things that actually make it sustainable. There was presidents in American history. If you worked for Lyndon Johnson, he was a nasty, humiliating jerk. You just read these things.
How do you really feel about it, Mike?
He treated his wife poorly, and and you just think, if you have a pressure-packed circumstance and you're adding another layer of pressure on top of that, and that's not an experience I had. It was very, very different. So.
Well, it's been great to get a chance to hear your thoughts and your perspective. Please join me in thanking Michael Gerson.
Thank you, sir.